Right. So you were just saying about the alternative medicine, alternative, medical treatments.
Yeah, actually, what I was getting at here is noticing recently that a lot of the health problems I'm dealing with have been improving, and it hasn't been the result of getting some kind of helpful diagnosis and treatment, but it's rather getting in touch with a lot of things that were formative for my childhood. It affected me throughout my life, and that have led to a situation where I'm having to confront them rather directly right now, after having not really been a problem for 65, 70 years. But and then I was explaining, because this is a little bit outside the box of normal thinking, not as much as it used to be, and it's because I was so involved with complementary and alternative healthcare back in the 70s and 80s, and still have a persisting interest in that. But it's the idea that you really cannot separate physiological and pathological processes in the body from the mind, and particularly the embodied mind with its emotional. Our emotions are such a big part of who and what we are. So for me, it makes sense, regardless of the physiological and pathological processes that may be responsible for manifesting symptoms, that the reason they occur is often somehow rooted in our psychological and emotional makeup. And that very often resolving, getting in touch with and resolving some sort of psychological or emotional conflict or problem or residual trauma can actually result in allowing the body to function better and some of these things to disappear. And so for what it's worth, and it doesn't matter to me who believes in, shares my belief in these things or not, but I feel like a lot of the recent improvements and like difficulties breathing and swallowing and things like that are directly due to circumstances having forced me to get in touch with some things that I haven't looked at ever.
Yeah,
Very formative things in my childhood. And so for what it's worth, I'm doing better these days than I was a week ago.
That's marvelous. And I was reading also about sort of some Freud's work early on, and where he would be able to cure people of physical ailments that had no medical thing, but they were completely debilitating, paralysis and all sorts of things, and allergies and things like that. And it is quite remarkable to look back on some of his work and see how powerful the mind really is in that mind-body continuum, right?
That is so true. And the things that he did are so wonderful. Unfortunately, as it happens, the term he used to describe these things, the cause of these things, was hysteria.
Yeah.
And to this day, what I've encountered is a physician carries out the standard tests and they don't find anything wrong, and it's all in your mind.
Yeah, as if that is like a bad thing or something one couldn't cure, or that's actually a good news if it's in your mind, right? That's not bad news. That's great news.
Wonderful news. It's like any diagnosis that tells you what the origin of the problem is, so that it can potentially lead to treatment.
Yeah.
But anyway, instead, there's this stigma, hypochondria, Munchausen's syndrome, all these things. You project your emotional problems onto your body, and they're not, these physical problems aren't real.
Yes, as if they're not real. That's right, as if they're not real, and this seems to vary by culture as well, and a sort of time period, and so East people from the Far East, they tend to quite often manifest physical symptoms because manifesting mental or emotional symptoms is stigmatized. It's problematic in that society. So it's all very interesting how these things show up.
So we've gone full circle, and now we stigmatize the appearance of physical symptoms.
Right. It's very, very strange. But I think it's just important to realize that that our mental state has this remarkable link to our physical one, and that we can't ignore one in favor of the other or treat one in favor of the other, and that it is real. It's all real.
That's right. And I'd like to just bring this into the realm of the Dharma too. There are those people out there who might listen to what I've just said and say, oh, well, what good has his practice done him if he's subject to having difficulty breathing because of something that happened emotionally in his childhood? And the absurdity of that is just incredible. I would compare it with somebody might develop a problem later in their life, which turns out to be genetic. And it's as absurd to expect their spiritual practice to have done something about that underlying problem that didn't manifest until circumstances were just right. To say that, their spiritual practice should have corrected for that. It's totally unrealistic. And as a matter of fact, I have no doubt that there are just as many advanced spiritual practitioners who are suffering and perhaps die from physical ailments that are at least compounded by unresolved psychological and emotional issues. There's no conceivable way that having chosen to adopt this path, that somehow you would never have acquired these kinds of issues, which it's clear that most human beings do and have. And then somehow that your spiritual practice is going to magically do away with them. To think that would happen, I think of it in terms of the embodied mind.
Right.
And this, sitting at the top of this embodied mind is this level of cognitive processing where our worldview is generated and where our propensities for suffering or not, or for causing suffering for others or not, all these other things lie. But there's sitting on top of everything else. You have a body that has all kinds of reflex mechanisms that they're built into it. Above that is a layer of instinct, which is based on these reflexes, but there's these additional, more complex mechanisms that trigger those reflexes under appropriate circumstances. You find that in reptiles and amphibians, and it's most predominant characteristic of their behavior. Then built on top of that is this whole emotional brain, which is one of the most powerful evolutionary inventions in terms of the nervous system. It orchestrates all of these other lower processes in response to circumstances. But as the nervous system has continued to evolve and develop, it is just as intimately involved at all of these levels above. So the emotional brain is sitting there, extending in and influencing every level above and below it in the embodied mind. So I guess what I'm getting at is no matter how awakened an embodied mind might happen to be at the level at which we generate worldviews and things like that, it's still an embodied mind, and all those other parts are still there. And every single thing that that person that has ever experienced, and every single response that they've ever generated to those things that they've experienced, has conditioned this embodied mind.
And the way that reality is then perceived as a consequence of that. That's sort of, I think, what Donald Hoffman was also going for in that talk that he gives, which was really interesting. I
have some things to say about Donald Hoffman. I don't know when and if there will be the time to get into that, but I really appreciate everything he's done. But there's one conclusion that he's overemphasizing to a point of absurdity.
Well, let's go there now while it's come up, and then we will jump back into story. I just want to check with you. Let me just pause for 1 second. Right. So we thought, like, while it's come up, and that's what I really like about our discussions is we've got a path that we're following, but we're free to stop and smell the roses, right?
Exactly.
So you actually shared the Donald Hoffman video with us in class at some point in our teacher training class, and it was a really fascinating video. And for those that haven't seen it, I will put the link in the description. But if you could perhaps summarize his theory here, and then perhaps talk about what you liked about it and what you object to, what you have differences with.
Yes, I'd be happy to. He's done an elegant job of putting in language that everybody can understand the indisputable fact that the world as we experience it, as we see it, is not the world as it is in itself. Okay? And he's gone beyond that to illustrate why this absolutely has to be so. So he compares our conscious representation of the world we live in to a computer interface. And he makes the point that on the basis of the electronics and the programming processes and everything else, on that basis of understanding, it would be impossible for us to use electronic devices. It is only because there is this illusory world of little yellow folders and trash cans and all these other things, all of these icons that appear on our screens that allow us to use our computers. And so that, that interface is necessary. So from this is a very good explanation about why it's inevitable that however we see the world, it's going to fall considerably short of being any kind of accurate representation of what the world is in and of itself. Because the whole purpose of our creating a representation of the world is to be able to survive and function successfully within the world. So we simplify things enough to be able to use them, and we ignore all those things that are not relevant to this central project of being able to function in the world. And I think that is beautiful and elegant. It's only novel, I suppose, from the point of view of modern Western thinking. It is, of course, the whole idea, this is another expression of the whole idea of emptiness. It's also an expression of the whole idea of phenomenology in Western philosophy. Anyway, it's beautiful, it's useful. It can help so many people understand things so much better. The step that I object to, first of all,
sorry, Julia, just hang on 1 second. I'm having an issue with the sound here. Just 1 second.
So Donald Hoffman has made a very valuable contribution to our collective modern understanding of the way of the phenomenological nature of our experience, but most especially of why it is that way and why it has to be that way. Where he's taken it that I disagree with, he goes a little bit too far. So in his researching of this idea that of why our model of reality will always fall short of reality in and of itself, he's run computer simulations of beings, of sort of AIs who it's up to these beings to understand the computer generated environment that they exist in. And in running these simulations, he found, and I don't consider it surprising at all, it was exactly what you'd expect, that more accurate representations of reality are non-functional, and that those AIs that interpret their artificial environment more accurately don't survive.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So,
which was a really bizarre thing to happen because it's contrary to.
But where you take the faulty step, which he does, of making this a kind of an absolute instead of a relative, which it is. I mean, the truth is that depending on the capacities of a mind, human or even a very simple AI operating within a computer, there's going to be a point at which you reach the limit of the capacities of that mind, and it cannot survive by generating, basically no benefit is derived and potential problems arise out of creating a more accurate and complete representation of reality. That's wonderful, that's clear. But he makes this into an absolute. And well, this is one little thing about absolutes and relatives anyway. Relatives can asymptotically approach an absolute without ever reaching it, and they always remain relative. The more sophisticated the mind, then the more capable of it is of operating from a more accurate interpretation of whatever underlying reality is in which it exists. And so if we look, for example, to say insight knowledge and the way this comes together to produce this radical change in perspective, in worldview, in our way of seeing ourselves in the world we live in, that constitutes awakening. So from Donald Hoffman, we can say no matter how awakened or how much insight a human mind attains, it is never going to be creating an internal representation that is completely accurate in terms of the external reality that it's a part of. That's fine. But what I think is equally obvious is that as long as we haven't tapped out the ultimate capacity of a mind, the more accurate its representation of reality is, the better it's going to work. The more successfully it's going to allow that mind to interpret every novel situation it finds itself in. The more consistently its representation of reality is going to work. It's going to allow for much better predictions. It's going to have tremendous explanatory power of why the world is appearing the way it is in this moment. And it's going to produce much better results in terms of, well, what's the best results that a human mind can expect. It's the well-being of the mind and body, eudaimonia, a state of overall well-being, physical and mental, and sort of optimizing that to the degree possible within the environment that exists. So that's my only issue with him, is that he just kind of stops with, and so you can never reach this absolutely perfect representation of reality. And is implied in that, or at least I've come across people who interpret that, is that, well, insight knowledge and the perspective provided by awakening isn't really any better than anything else, right? Well, it's still imperfect, but there would be no point at all if it didn't work better.
Yeah.
And of course, Donald would say, yeah, that's really all it's about, is how well it works. But whereas he would say, and how well it works doesn't really have anything at all to do with how accurate it is. And I would say, no, that's wrong. As long as you're within the capacities of this mind, how well it works is going to be a direct function of how accurate it is. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the whole basis of science, right? You have a hypothesis. How well does it predict? How well does it explain? Over and over again, it succeeds in explaining and predicting. And so it achieves the status of a theory, and even when you reach the point where there are things that it can no longer adequately explain or predict, that just means it's time for a new theory that doesn't supersede, quantum physics doesn't supersede Newtonian physics, nor in any other realm of human endeavor does a newer theory necessarily supersede an old one. More often, because of the validity of the old theory was established through how successful it was in terms of prediction and explanation, its validity never disappears, right? It's just built upon to the next level. And so that's my thing is Donald, don't start saying things that sound like they're discounting the ability of us. That they're discounting the ability to enjoy a much happier and more fulfilling and wholesome life as being just another delusion. Mm-hmm. Well, yes, compared to ultimate reality, it may be another delusion, but it's not just another delusion. It's a far better delusion, and it is also a far more accurate delusion. Right?
Yeah. So this I mean, this really fits with, I think, the way that you've explained what's happening during Insight, which is we are essentially updating our mental working models of reality to ones that's closer to the ultimate reality than it was before, and therefore works better and creates less suffering. And is that sort of in a nutshell what we're talking about?
That's exactly right. That's my point.
Yeah. Because that was the interesting bit, is that at some point in his talk, he says, yeah, but some of his, created beings, once they started perceiving reality too accurately, they actually started being less successful at survival, right? And you're saying that's not what's really happening with, us as human beings or animals or whatever the case may be.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I was intrigued about that research, and perhaps you could comment on that, is those beings that he created. I mean, yes, so he's modeled an external reality for them, but is he modeling an internal reality for them as well?
In order to function, he didn't create the internal reality. That would have negated the whole the whole purpose of these AIs created their own internal reality in order to function within the external reality that he created. Because he had created the external reality, of course, he knew its exact parameters. And then he could look at the way the AI developed itself and compare the parameters.
So sorry, just about where you were last, if you could finish up or, continue with what you were saying there.
Yeah. Well, can you remember the last question you asked?
Well, the last thing that I heard was we were talking about Donald Hoffman, and we were talking about the accuracy of this model.
You had asked a question, though. You said, does that mean Donald Hoffman?
Oh, yeah. We were talking about whether they had whether these beings, whether he had created an internal a mind for them, let's put it that way, whether he'd created a mind, but I think what you were saying is that the mind was created as a function of the reality that they were experiencing.
That's right. This is, as an AI, that's what an AI is capable of doing. It's capable of learning and creating a representation of its environment to function in, right? That's the annoying thing that the AI behind your Google search does. Is it tries to create an understanding of what you really want or what you'll be most happy with, and so it doesn't deliver what you really want and what would make you most happy, because AIs are stupid by nature. Anyway, enough of that little diatribe. Yeah, no, what Donald was doing, Donald, he was a god. Okay, other people in his service had done this, but he had created these AIs and he had created a world for them to live in. And because he had created this world, he knew exactly what its parameters were and how it worked. And because he created these AIs, he could look into their minds and he could see what the model was of this that they had created, what their internal model was of this external reality that he had created. Isn't it nice to see Donald as God in that way? Anyway, so yeah, that's what he was doing. He was comparing what they had independently on their own generated that allowed them to survive in this environment that he had created.
Right, but there is quite a difference between that and the human mind, right? Because to
the degree that we don't quite understand the complexities of how the human mind works well enough that we can make AIs that function the same way as a human mind. That's true. But, overall, it's an extremely good model of how a human mind works in this world that it can never really know.
Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating research that he's done, and people would do well to watch the little talk, which is actually pretty short and very accessible. So I'll put the link down there for that. But to kind of tie this back into what we started from, where we, through our meditation practice, through our following the Eightfold Path, we are and developing these insights, we are coming up with a better model of reality that hopefully functions better. Let me play devil's advocate for a second and say, in your case, for somebody who has, spent decades doing this and really achieved, if you like, some of the goals that the Buddha and Buddhism and meditation lays out. How is it that you kind of bypassed, to use that term, sort of spiritual bypass, these difficult childhood experiences that you'd had, or whatever things that are now only being resolved or directly interacted with?
Okay, yes, certainly. And what I'm going to say is not unique to me, but it varies from individual to individual enormously by degree. But childhood trauma dramatically affects the way many aspects of our psychological functioning develop. How we use our emotions and how we behave in response to situations and things like this. In my case, there were disruptions to certain aspects of what would be considered normal psycho-emotional development. I basically grew up like Romulus and Remus raised by wolves. I grew up in isolation. I didn't have friends. I didn't have a peer group. I didn't go to school. So all these sorts of things that provide the, quote, normal environment in which a, quote, normal psyche develops happened differently for me. Now, one of the things that you remarked on as I told my story is how well I've done compared to many others in terms of having come from this kind of traumatic background. Well, what this is due to is, for whatever reasons, I developed coping mechanisms that allowed me to appear normal and to function successfully in society. So therefore, these things didn't manifest as an overt problem for a very long time. I'll take, perhaps the two biggest psychological tendencies that have carried with me and affected me every single day of my life, but at the same time have remained relatively invisible to others and completely invisible to myself, are a lack of ability to establish external boundaries between myself and other people, and a powerful tendency to avoid conflict in any way and at any cost. So these are abnormalities of development, and for many people, they produce all kinds of disastrous problems. I was just able, for whatever reason, to be able to function in the world and succeed in spite of these. All right? So it wasn't until many, many decades later that a situation arose where this caught up with me. My coping mechanisms they weren't adequate, okay? And because of these tendencies, I allowed the situation to develop, which turned out to be catastrophic for me. And this was a wonderful gift because it made me aware of something. I was able to get the help of people with the expertise to understand what this was and to be able to do something about this and make changes. Of course, there are so many other people with exactly the same kind of developmental abnormalities during their childhood due to childhood trauma, adverse childhood events, I think are what they're called in psychology, right? And their coping mechanisms which the only reason they had those coping mechanisms, once again, were like Donald's AIs, is because they did work up to a point.
Right.
But then they reached a point in their life where they no longer worked, and the whole thing collapsed. In a sense, for a lot of these people, what happened to me when I was 70 was what happens to a lot of these people in their early adulthood, or when they start trying to establish relationships and families and things like that. So, that's the difference. And I don't know, is that answering your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in a sense, I think what you're saying is you developed really excellent coping mechanisms, really adaptive ones that worked for a very long time until they didn't work. And right. And that, I mean, doesn't it harken back to what we were talking about? Yogi who goes and lives in a cave is never really going to develop insight into reality as far as it could, because his coping mechanisms, because his way of seeing reality is never challenged by the difficulties that we experience, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, isn't that where like the whole samsara is nirvana? Nirvana is samsara. Very easy to be calm and beatific if you're living by yourself, but go and live with your in-laws for a year, and then you'll really, test whether you have developed adaptive ways of coping with problems.
Right. I think it was Ram Dass, wasn't it, who said, if you think you're enlightened, go home.
Go home. Go spend some time with your family. The way I always think about these things is, imagine if you had never pursued your meditation, your path with meditation, your path with Buddhism, your path with trying to understand reality and suffering. If you had never done any of that, what kind of person might you have been? And chances are probably not a very nice or successfully integrated into society.
Right? Yes, I'd say the probabilities of that happening, yeah. Right.
Well, let me put it this way: some people have similar trauma experiences to you, and they never end up functioning well in society, and they're always emotionally but you developed in such a way that you were able to continue living your life quite successfully until the age of 70, when finally these coping mechanisms that you had were no longer adaptive. And that was the first time that you had to actually challenge them and change them.
That's right. There was this juncture in my life where for 3 years, I was living on the streets.
Yeah.
I was basically living with other damaged people who were functioning within the realm of their coping mechanisms. And essentially, one way of looking at that street of our society these are people who have found some coping mechanisms that work for them. Yeah. Okay, so retreating to that sort of a kind of an underbelly of society is in itself a large-scale coping mechanism that includes within it all kinds of other coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
If we put these on a spectrum, retreating from society into a mountain cave, or for that matter, another version of that is to become a permanent prison inmate who every time you're released makes his way back to prison. So moving to a cave, doing that, perhaps descending into the world of chronic narcotic use and things like that. Perhaps the ultimate coping mechanism for any damaged person is a bullet to the brain or an overdose of medications or something like that. I would put retreating to a cave on that same spectrum with becoming a lifetime prisoner or becoming a drug addict or committing suicide.
Well, that's quite a radical thing to say.
I made a decision. What was the essence of the decision I made? To rejoin the world, right? That was the essence of it. That was the magic. How and why I made that decision, all kinds of things. None of which I can take credit for. I can just say, my God, I am so thankful that I made that decision. Mm-hmm. Not only did I make that decision, I took action. I came out of that cave, which really the life on the streets was. I came out of that cave, re-entered the world, and learned to function within it.
Mm-hmm. So, it brings up something that I think comes up a lot for me with clients, which is that every, and I want to say this without seeming sort of patronizing to people, but every difficult, painful, suffering experience that we come into contact with, that we are exposed to, actually has a very positive side to it if we were able to see it in the right way. So this great difficulty that you talked about, having these maladaptive coping mechanisms of not setting up boundaries with people and avoiding conflict, when they were directly challenged and you saw, hell, these things are not working, this is not a good way to lead my life, even though that experience was in itself painful, it was an opportunity that you then grabbed to say, wow, I can change this and make it better.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's very difficult. Sorry.
Yeah. What I've said before, I know I've said this to you, all of these cumulative experiences in my life have taught me over and over again, there is nothing that happens that doesn't have a potential good side to it. And, if there were, the best thing that you could ever do for any of your patients or clients is to bring them to the point of leaving their cave or making the attempt. If you could just communicate to them the possibility that you can take at least some of these lemons that life has given you and make lemonade.
Yeah.
That, I think that will have an internal transformative power. All of their experience before has just reinforced the cycle that they're in that has led them to be where they were. Yeah. And this is the single internal transformation, basically in the way you look at things.
Yeah.
That's what it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Transformation in the way you look at things that can just completely change the trajectory that your patients are on.
And the fact that people are coming to therapy or starting to meditate means that they are ready to change. There's something in them that wants to change. There is something that says things could be different, things could be better.
That's right. There is no one who comes to meditation or in so many other things in life, whether whether it's religion or political beliefs or whatever it is, that this isn't true of. This is what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
And the other thing is a point that I want to make is yes, I had a lot of early childhood trauma, and it did make me abnormal in some ways. But there's an idea that I think in a lot of people's minds that would put me in this category over here that's very different than this big category that they belong to. And I would say, actually, that's not true. I'm not in that category there. because of my coping mechanism, I'm over here in the same category with you and the same reasons. You didn't emerge from life's trials and tribulations unscathed either, you know. And for you to assume that my quote abnormalities are necessarily any greater than yours is foolish. While it's true that most of psychology and most therapy is about bringing a person from a dysfunctional state of damage to the normal level of functioning, doesn't mean that they're necessarily, that everybody else is different from that, right? It's just some people's coping mechanisms are better. For most of my life, anybody would look at me and said, well, boy, is this ever a well-adjusted person? And people did say that. And when they found out about my background, they said, wow, how could this be true? But
the average person is dealing with just the same kinds of problems, just they're perhaps not as immediately apparent, or they don't seem to take on such a dramatic form. But ultimately, suffering is suffering, right?
Oh yes,
yeah,
and yeah.
And we all, and this is how it goes right back to what the Buddha said. We all grow old, grow sick, die. There are, there's no escaping that there is this suffering, and the best thing we can do is find a way to deal with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
So fantastic discussion. I think at some point we might want to come back to sort of spiritual bypassing, because I think it's something that's kind of become a buzzword and has been talked a lot over the last few years. And I think would be really great to get your opinion on that. So, for you to weigh in on that. So I'll just sort of add that to where, something that we might spend a bit of time on in future. But are you okay with us jumping back into your life story again and going back there?
Absolutely.
Yeah. More or less where we had left off was just that you had discovered that you might not actually have ALS, but have this neurological Lyme disease, and that there was something that you could do about it.
Yes. This was a period where my life was completely turned upside down in every way. And it's really interesting in narrating this that I see it as that, because at the time, it didn't seem like it at all. At the time, I was just, each day when I woke up, I began dealing with what was in front of me, left over from the day before or newly arisen in this day. And it's only in retrospect that I can recognize how totally every aspect of my life was turned around and how profound many of these changes were. Yes, I was diagnosed with ALS. I was always a very active, healthy, and strong person. I've always been very outdoor oriented. For me, the mountain range that I lived in was my backyard, and I was used to walking in and exploring every aspect of it. Everything around me and everything that's there today, I had built from nothing with my hands. I was used to that. I was used to being capable of doing those things, and I loved doing those things. And then I found myself unable to get up from a chair unassisted, unable to get up from a meditation cushion without somebody's help, unable to, not only not walk miles through my mountain home, but to walk 200 or 300 feet became more and more difficult. This was a shift in my reality that was present every day, in every hour of every day, and it was getting worse day by day. And what's remarkable to me in retrospect is how I just took it for granted. It is what it is. And how wonderful it is that I did, because I didn't suffer, I didn't lament, I didn't resist, I didn't regret. Instead, I did what I could. And it's amazing what I did. So with my parents building a house and our having to move into half of what was our bed and breakfast that we rented out, and thereby losing that income. But at the same time, having spent the last couple of years doing more teaching and having been encouraged by some of these students to create a nonprofit, and from which I could, pay myself $1,200 a month or whatever it was to make up for that lost income from the bed and breakfast. I spent my time doing this. I was dealing with this situation. As I'd gone from being a very independent person to a very dependent person. My wife insisted on driving me anywhere, everywhere, taking me to every medical appointment. I think at some point I almost forgot how to drive. Yes, I had written the first 6 chapters of TMI and put it up online. But now in all these hours that I found myself chair-bound, I began to work on putting the rest of this together and refining those first 6 chapters, or first 6 stages. There wasn't anything about my life that wasn't dramatically changed in this period. And I was quite happy. As far as I was concerned, things were going pretty well. But the level of change with my parents living with us, and I had reestablished good relationships with my parents, but the degree of the traumatic influence of my mother on me in so many ways that I wasn't even aware of, to have my mother once again living just a few hundred feet away from where Nancy and I were living, to have Nancy take over the exact role that my mother had occupied with regard to me as a child, to have myself in between my mother with all of the residue that I had from that relationship and my wife Nancy on the other side, because boy, they just didn't get along at all. Yeah, absolutely everything in my life was turned upside down, and it became an enormously fruitful period. I completed that book. And once it was published, I initiated teacher training classes. I continued to the degree that I could to lead retreats and to do teachings online.
Julie Gus, it feels like we've skipped over some important bits here. So let me see if I can just make sure that I've understood where we're at. And at the end of 2008, you now knew that you had neurological Lyme disease rather than ALS. So it's still a very serious condition, but not quite as rapidly degenerating and with no, right.
And the other thing about neurological Lyme disease, whereas ALS is a straight downward path, neurological Lyme disease goes up and down and up and down. So I don't remember how many times over those years I went through the cycle of not being able to get up, not being able to walk, beginning to regain my strength, and walking until I was once again spending the day or spending half a day in the mountains and covering 7-10 miles of mountain trails. Only a few months later to find myself back unable to stand up by myself, unable to walk 200 yards without sitting down to rest. And having to, the next cycle would come and I would go through that.
And then this put you now again back into, as you said, in a position where you started being more dependent on other people. And your mother, although it seems like you said over the 20 years previously, you had repaired your relationship with her somewhat. But now you were again in a kind of helpless position in a kind of way that you were as a child, and you had Nancy on one side and your mum on the other, and the two of them, there was a lot of friction between. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you coped with that? Because this would seem to be important in terms of, you say, establishing boundaries and dealing with conflict, which you said was one of your big sort of blind spots.
I retreated to the cave of my own mind and my work. I spent my waking hours working on my book, teaching, talking to people about the Dharma and about meditation. I retreated to the cave of my mind and my work.
Mm-hmm. Would that be an example of spiritual bypassing?
Absolutely not. That's an example of a successful coping mechanism.
Okay.
In those circumstances, it worked. That same coping mechanism didn't work a few years later.
Okay. So I think that is important that you put it that way. Yes, it was actually a very adaptive thing that you did at that time.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the total opposite of spiritual bypassing.
Okay. And so when you did that, how did the idea come about to, because you said what you had posted online, and I think I have seen it, a friend of mine mentioned it. It was just a simple PDF of the first 6 stages. It was light on detail, but it did have the framework that eventually became TMI. How did that develop? So you'd started Dharma Treasure, and that presumably had more of the Chinese community from Southern California who were visiting you. Were they visiting you there? Were you flying out to them, or what was going on in that sense?
Well, it started out initially that they were coming to me, but I ended up going to them. I went to them many times, led many retreats there. Spent a lot of wonderful time with those people.
Right. And so how did this develop into Dharma Treasure as we knew it up until a few years ago, where you were teaching people that were not just from that community, but more broadly interested in your work? Because I think you said you also taught at Tucson at a meditation society there. And how did the idea of TMI come about as a project that you really wanted to put together this book and publish it?
Yes, the book and Dharma Treasure and all of these other things did come together in a wonderful confluence of possibilities that I was able to shape into a reality. Where the book came from, I mean, there's that original first 6 stages on the internet was because my experience of opening myself up to the larger world of Dharma seekers and meditators was the shocking discovery of how little anybody knew, how misunderstood meditation was, meditation techniques, all of these sorts of things, and how much help that I could provide people in just a little bit of advice and pointing and things like that. And so I was overjoyed to be able to do this. Enough so that it overcame whatever reluctance that I had to the idea of becoming a quote teacher, because I could see myself not as a teacher, but as a spiritual friend, sharing with people, hey friend, we're on the same journey here. Look, I can tell you some things that'll make it much better for you. And I did. So it was things that I had learned over all of these years that, and that I had been sharing with people that became that first 6 stages on the internet. And it was what I was sharing with people, on these retreats and in these other situations. It was only natural that when I found myself, as I say, chair bound for hours out of every day, that I would just try to put this all down there and make it more available, more accessible, more understandable. As you say, it was short on detail, but fill in the detail. It's basically just sharing all the things that I had learned over these many years, and which I had seen how much just a little bit of that sharing could help so many people. Now, Dharma Treasure came into existence for certain specific purposes, basically allowing people to assist me in being able to teach and get a tax receipt for the money they spent doing that. But as things developed, I began to realize the potential of Dharma Treasure to be so much more. When I completed TMI, I discovered, I did go to publishers. I went to Wisdom and Wisdom Books and other places like that. And I discovered what a horrible mess the whole publishing industry was. And as I learned more and more about it, I was amazed that anybody ever went through publishers anymore, and why everybody didn't self-publish. And so it occurred to me that Dharma Treasure could be the vehicle for this, basically functioning in the same way it has. And there were people who were extremely supportive of the idea of me self-publishing. And just as my Chinese supporters before them, would provide the money for me to have somebody else do the layout and the formatting and to create a cover, and that, because they could donate the money to Dharma Treasure earmarked specifically for this purpose and no other. I could pay to have these things done, eventually to have the book printed and things like that. So now Dharma Treasure really became, in a much bigger way than it ever had before, a vehicle for making this book and my teaching in the form of this book available to so many other people. It was wonderful. It was a perfect thing. And then just to be as on the up and up as possible as I could about this. There was absolutely no reason why, that once Dharma Treasure had paid for this book for all illustrations to be recreated and the layout and all of this stuff, and for the initial print runs, and once it began to sell, it sold really well as a self-published book. And there was no need to do this, but I chose to, I chose to, from the income from the sales of the book, to pay to Dharma Treasure before I ever took a penny for myself, every cent that had been donated, so that every cent that had been donated, earmarked to be used for producing the book, now was going back into Dharma Treasure, not earmarked for any specific purpose, but for Dharma Treasure to be able to, in other words, this was also a wonderful opportunity to create the word escapes me. What is it that institutions, organizations have, the financial nugget that allows them to continue their work?
I don't know.
Endowment.
Sorry, endowment.
I was essentially creating an endowment for Dharma Treasure to be able to do future work. And so I did that. Once it was published, then I also had the idea of, well, I can teach, one of the things is I was pretty debilitated in terms of my physical stamina and everything else in my time. And how many people can I teach directly interfacing with, one-on-one or me sitting in front of a group of 20 or 30 of them? I still didn't know how long I'd live. I still didn't know what I'd be capable of. And this idea that if I teach other people to teach what I presented in Dharma Treasure, then it multiplies. Then it's like I create these, in a sense, clones of myself that are able to go out, and each one of them can sit in front of their own group of 20 or 30 people. Each one of them can teach one-on-one with as many people as they want. And it's like it multiplies what I could do. What a wonderful way to deal with this. It seemed like the perfect solution. I did that. And, from this, now as I began to start, we're going ahead years, over a few years of doing this now. But then in what other ways now could Dharma Treasure serve as a vehicle to assist these people in doing this? I had basically gone from relative obscurity. I mean, yes, I had people in Tucson, I had people in Southern California, I had some people in Massachusetts and New York who knew me and were eager to have me teach and things like that. But after the publication of my book, I went from this relative obscurity to being well known. And so, here I am, I'm teaching other people to do what I do. I realized Dharma Treasure had the potential to be a vehicle to launch them into a position where they could reach more people, where they might be recognized as teachers. And I mean, after all, my whole purpose was to multiply what I was able to do. And so Dharma Treasure took on this whole new realm of possibilities of what it could be, and continued to develop along the lines of that. So the book, as an enormously more effective way of sharing what I had learned with everybody else, and then Dharma Treasure, which had started out with a much simpler purpose, and then as I created this endowment from the income from the book, now became it's the same thing. It became this potential powerful vehicle. Needless to say, all of this gave so much more meaning and purpose to my life, and all the joy and everything else that comes with that. Now, the sad thing is, I created something really beautiful and powerful with Dharma Treasure and with TMI. And we were talking about the point where our coping mechanisms failed. And that's what happened. This wonderful thing that I had created. Not only that, let me speak to something else. This empty piece of land in the mountains that I had moved to in 1996, I had built into a beautiful place. Nancy and I working together, a place that was designed in every way to be in maximal harmony with this unique and developed and delicate environment it was a part of. This incredibly beautiful location. Much of it the labor of my own hands and arms and legs and feet. And it had become, a part of this growing, developing thing, so that it too all of this became a part of this vehicle to share what I had learned and that I discovered was so helpful to so many people with more people as much as possible. Then it was also a situation very different than I had ever been in my life before. And those differences butted heads directly with the coping mechanisms that, I was outside of any of the different caves of comfort I had created for myself in the past. And I was totally naive of the skills and abilities that I totally lacked. As a result, people that I loved and care about, for whatever, I'll never truly be able to understand why, but they destroyed everything that I had built. They destroyed Dharma Treasure and this beautiful place in the wilderness that I created, because once they had removed me from it, there was no one there that understood its place in the local ecology. And now I go up on the mountain and I look down on it, and what once had been some roofs poking out of some beautiful forested area and is now a big chunk of barren desert with buildings and cars and everything all over the place in the middle of this otherwise beautiful, pristine canyon. So, yeah, I've had the remarkable life experience of building something beautiful and wonderful and seeing it all come crashing down around me.
It does though, remind me a lot of when you said you can have very good intentions in doing something, but the way that it actually turns out is not always within your control.
That's right. Yes, it's certainly not, for a lot of reasons. One reason it's always there is that things are going to happen that you could never predict.
Mm-hmm. But it seems this whole situation really pains you, because this was something so important to you.
Oh, mostly what I feel is I feel sadness about it. But I understand now. At first I couldn't understand how or why this had happened, but I've since come to understand that. And once again, I have learned so much from it. I, as a result of trying to understand how and why this happened, I have gone into myself very deeply in ways that the Dharma and meditation, well, meditation made it easier to do this successfully, but could never have brought about itself. The only thing that could have brought this about was to be suddenly awakened to, the fact that something is really wrong here, and somehow I'm responsible for it, even if I don't see how I am. I feel like I'm so much more of a complete person, complete, healthy, wholesome person now because this happened. And also, yeah, I can be sad because of the unrealized potential, the as yet unrealized potential of what could have been. But that takes nothing away from the realized potential of what was, right?
Yeah.
And what is yet to unfold in life? I don't know, but I'm really eager to find out.
Yeah.
And the last thing I want to do is to hold myself back by clinging to what could have been in the past. What happened was wonderful. There's sadness about the form that it took. But, all of my life has been like that. And maybe not in as extreme forms, but all of your life and anybody's life has been like this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it is that, it's that cliche that you mentioned early on, but isn't it a beautiful and true one that making lemons out of lemonade, right? Doesn't mean it doesn't still have a bitter taste to it sometimes, but it did ultimately have some good come out of it if you're in the right mind frame to be able to see that and to make use of it, right?
Yeah, that's right. This is a good opportunity. There's something that I said early on in one of these interviews with you, to the effect that life never gives us something that we can't potentially deal with.
Yes.
And I had somebody come back to me and say, then you're making, for everybody who hasn't been able to deal with what life has given you, you're making it their fault. And that was certainly not my intent. It's not their fault. They, it was the unfolding of causes and conditions in a way. But one of the things is everything in my life has said to me, this is not a deterministic universe. That it is true that in every moment, there are probabilities that will very likely describe how you're going to respond and what the next moment is going to be like. But they're only probabilities. What I'm trying to communicate is that there is that potential to inherent in this, there is that potential to go beyond your previous limitations in every situation. Even if it's in the moment before your death, you can meet your death in a much more wholesome way. That's a dramatic example, but what I would like to communicate to all these people that have had their lives fall apart in one way or another and perhaps have not found the positive in that is, I don't want to tell them that it was their fault, because it wasn't. They were who they were at that time due to causes and conditions, and the circumstances were what they were. And the other people they interacted with were what they were. What I want to communicate to them is, in whatever situation you're in now, in whatever situations that may come up in the future, you don't have to, this doesn't have to repeat itself again. There is always that potential. There's always that possibility. And it's not your fault if you don't find it and realize it this time. Just know that it was there. If you can bear the pain of it, look back and see how it could have been there so that next time you're more likely to do better. That's what I was trying to say. I was never trying to imply that people who had the kind of traumatic circumstances that I did are at fault for not having it come through. I mean, I was lucky. I can't take the credit for it. But the important thing about that isn't that I was lucky, but it's that potential is always there for everyone.
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful, I think that's a really important point you've brought up, because it can come across as patronizing or victim blaming, because let's use a more common example. Let's say somebody loses their child drowns in a pool, or on a small scale, or something on a larger scale. Jewish people in World War II, where 6 million of them were killed, right? And we sort of go, well, how do you make lemonade out of those lemons? And if you can't, are you somehow a failed person, a bad human being? How do you respond to people who've had those really extreme? Because you've had some pretty extreme forms of tragedy in your life. How do you teach that to other people? How do you teach them to make that? I mean, Viktor Frankl wrote such a wonderful book about it, which we've talked about a few times. But it's still very difficult to imagine sitting in a concentration camp and having seen your parents gassed the day before and your brothers, and you're the last one there, and somehow you're supposed to rise above this or see the positive in it. It does seem like it's quite a callous thing to say to people.
Well, yes, and it so easily can. And I think Viktor Frankl did a very good job of trying to communicate that without making it seem callous. Although people have, and people always will, put a different twist on this thing. And in my own case, like, there were things that happened before I ever discovered the Buddha Dharma that were just very fortunate for me. But once I began to learn the Buddha Dharma, once I began to incorporate it into my life, more importantly, once some of these shifts in the way I saw things began to occur, I was in a place where I was acting on this potential. So how do you communicate? You can tell people that this potential is there, but the fact is, one of the biggest factors in people's inability to see and recognize and act on that potential is that, back to Donald Hoffman, they're viewing the universe that they live in from a limited perspective, which only allows certain possibilities and not others. And that's the tragedy of it. And the only ultimate solution that I know of is to share with as many people as possible the ways and means to acquire a better model of the world they live in, which will allow them to respond better to the situations that life is inevitably going to present every single one of us with.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, to speak to people that are struggling with these issues in their life, their child is drowned, their parents were gassed in a gas chamber, whatever, any of these things. About the only thing that you can do is say, there is this potential. It is possible. I mean, it's the only thing the Buddha could do, or that any of us modern proponents of the Buddha's teaching can do, is to say, friends, there is a way. There really is. And it's not necessarily an easy way. It doesn't necessarily happen by itself or overnight. Although I will point out to you, Viktor Frankl, there is no question, he underwent insight and awakening in the same sense that we're talking about. And he didn't do it as a result of formal training and practice. He didn't even know about these things at the time. But so it can happen, and it does happen. And, you know, like I say, practice only makes this kind of insight and awakening more likely. But it can and does happen, did. And Viktor Frankl is an example of the fact that it does.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because there are certainly individuals that I have looked at throughout, you know, history, and that didn't practice meditation or anything even remotely resembling Buddha Dharma formally, but you could say that person is a truly awakened person in terms of they are no longer, they've transformed their suffering into something else, right? And
yeah, I'd like to take us back to Donald Hoffman too.
Yeah.
It's not just that they stumbled upon a different way of modeling the world that happened to work better for them. There's a consistency about that. You know, it's, to me, that says what it basically comes down to is there are specific ways in which the way we view the world is very non-functional, and there are specific ways that are much more consistent with whatever the nature is of this world that we live in and of itself. And that's why, under all kinds of different circumstances and in different cultures and in different spiritual settings and all of these things, people keep arriving at this same place.
Yeah.
It's because there is, it may still be a relative truth, but there is a directionality to these better relative truths. It is approaching something. It may never, it can never reach that ultimate truth, but it can get closer. And that's why, under all these different circumstances, you know, this takes us back to the idea of a perennial philosophy, which says that all spiritual paths and all these things are leading in the same direction. And I find it appalling that there are people who can't recognize that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Question.
Right. So I think what I was saying when I lost, the last thing that I said before we lost connection was that, you know, whether it's a paper cut or a murder, it is the same mechanism that underlies the suffering that results from that, right?
That's right. It is.
Yeah. And then that was the one thing that I got from it. The other, sorry, did you want to add something there?
No.
And then the other part that I got from what you said is that the Buddha or whoever, whether it's the Buddha or Viktor Frankl, they can point to that. It's the finger pointing at the moon. They can point to it, but they can't make you see it for yourself. That's something that you yourself have to then do, either through meditation or therapy or whatever modality that allows you to get closer to that perennial truth.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So have I summarized sort of more or less where we are with understanding what Buddha Dharma allows us to do with suffering?
Yes, I think we have.
Okay.
I mean, maybe I'll just add something else, maybe add a little bit of clarity to this. When we are in a new situation, which we are constantly, every day, in that situation, we are going to interpret incoming information on the basis of the ways that we have interpreted such information in the past. In any logical process, whether we're talking about a mathematical theorem, or whether we're talking about a computer program, or if we're talking about the way the human mind works, the process, the first step in the process of in the processing of new information is there are certain assumptions that have been there, and they've been there for a whole variety of reasons, but one of them is that they work reasonably well up to now. And they are going to determine the end result of that information processing, you know. And this has been expressed in a lot of different ways. A really common one in the digital world is garbage in, garbage out. You know, all of the, and it's not really garbage in that's the problem. It's that if the very first steps that your mind takes in processing information are faulty ones, then the result is always going to be faulty. What the Buddha is talking about, what we're talking about, is replacing those deep underlying assumptions. You know, we can express that in terms of insight. There's a deep underlying assumption of relative separateness. I'm a separate entity in a world of other separate entities. And yes, we interact causally, but those interactions are relatively limited. And I have a pretty accurate view of reality in my mind. And if that view is accurate enough, then I can manipulate circumstances to maximize my happiness and to minimize my suffering. All of these are basic underlying assumptions that lead to all of the problems and suffering that we have. No matter what situation you're in, once that information enters your mind, it's going to be processed beginning with those faulty assumptions, and you're going to get the same result that you always have, which is that you're going to have a lot of unnecessary suffering. You're going to make decisions and do things that are going to produce unfortunate results. You're going to cause a lot of suffering, not only for your future self, but for other people. And the solution is to replace those basic assumptions. But they are very basic. They are very basic, and they're not easy to replace. There's only one thing that's going to bring your mind to replace them, is to have the kind of experiences that just make it just unavoidably obvious that this is a better way, this is a better assumption to operate on than that one. You know, this is what the practice is all about. This is what insight is all about. It is those experiences are always there, everything, constantly. You know, as Leonard Cohen says in one of his songs, ring the bell that still can ring. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets through. You know, and this is the crack that we're talking about, and this is the light that we're talking about, is that there are always these situations which are actually pointing out to you that there's something wrong with the assumptions you're operating on, and there's a better one. But how, you know, the problem and what the path is all about is how do we bring your mind to recognizing and then replacing its faulty assumptions with these superior ones, with these better ones.
Yeah.
And when you do that, then it's as if the problems magically disappear. you change these basic assumptions, and when you get to the end of the process, you don't respond by going into a state of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
You
but
don't
actually,
respond by taking inappropriate action.
mm-hmm. But actually, nothing's changed, right? Because you still have ALS, or you still, your child is still dead, or nothing's actually changed. But your perception of it has so radically shifted that suffering no longer arises.
That's right.
Yeah.
Acceptance becomes easier because you understand, it couldn't be any other way.
Right. But I think the problem comes in with so many, like Viktor Frankl, he can point to that, and he can say, this is, you can tell people this is the nature of reality. We're not, in fact, these separate things. One can have an intellectual understanding of something, but that's not enough, right? It's important, I think you've said, it's important to have that intellectual understanding as well, but you need to have that experiential change that takes place.
Yes, it's experiential. Absolutely no amount of intellectual understanding is going to have this effect. It just simply is not. And the worst thing about an intellectual understanding is that in your logical processing, it doesn't take but a minor flaw in that your intellectual understanding is incorrect in some way. And having an intellectual understanding of, for example, what no self is all about, can create an enormous obstacle to you ever being able to intuitively understand what no self is really about.
And so that's where the right
tremendous downfall to intellectual understanding.
Yeah.
It won't accomplish the job, and it can get in the way.
Mm-hmm. And so this is why it seems to me like traditions like Zen say as little as possible about it, for that reason. But that also has, of course, its own problems, whereas you've now laid things out much more systematically in stages and insights. But that can also, clinging to that map or that model too much can also cause problems, right?
It can, and people do that. I think that's a problem that is more readily overcome. I mean, somebody that's a little more experienced can say, look, you're getting yourself stuck. You don't need to be. But one of the things that I deliberately avoided doing as much as possible was telling people what they might discover in this process.
Yes.
And because there's so many people out there who are super eager and willing to tell them what they're going to discover, and it's not necessarily what they're going to discover anyway, but they'll look at TMI and say, oh well, this just doesn't do that. Well, it doesn't do that for a reason. I don't want your mind to fabricate an understanding that it doesn't have. I want you to discover experientially. The Buddha, and talking about what we call insight, knowledge, and wisdom, used the term jnana dasana. Jnana means knowledge, and it can include intellectual knowledge as well as experiential or intuitive knowledge. And what we call insight knowledge is a form of intuitive understanding that arises out of direct experience rather than out of thought and analysis and things like that. And the term dasana means seeing directly, basically experiential. So when you put the term jnana together with the word dasana, you have something that basically means intuitive knowledge or insight knowledge or knowledge derived from direct experience. And that distinguishes this knowledge that constitutes insight or wisdom from intellectual understanding, right? And that is such a very important thing. Intellectual understanding in the form of the first noble truth, right understanding, when it's done properly, when it's not mistaken for something other than what it is, when it doesn't lead to papancha, to the elaboration of these incorrect notions that can act as obstacles, it's very helpful, because as your mind is accumulating this direct experience, it can provide a kind of guidance as to how to put this together in a meaningful way. So it does serve a purpose, but nevertheless, intellectual understanding of any kind is dangerous. It's dangerous because you can mistake it as being the same as intuitive knowledge. It's dangerous in that rather than facilitating the development of the intuitive knowledge that's there waiting to be discovered, that flawed intellectual understanding can create an potentially insurmountable barrier to putting this information together in such a way that you arrive at the insight understanding that's going to make a difference.
So the question then would be, and then I think we'll leave it there until next time, but the question then would be, how does one avoid falling into that particular trap, especially now when there are so many books, so many teachers, and so many people who are putting out information out there that can be misinterpreted, or that they themselves are putting out information that they've misunderstood?
It's a very big problem, and it's a big challenge, and I don't know the answer. But I hope just by saying what I've said and having this go up on YouTube eventually, it's one step towards that.
Yeah.
That somebody will listen to what I say and take it to heart.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is at the end, though, also about that ehipassiko. Figure it out for yourself, compare, and go. I think one of the things you've said is, go back to the suttas and really study these things and look at the things that seem like contradictions and finding a way to strip away misunderstandings and difficulties. Right?
Yes. Yeah, and you have to approach the suttas not as the word of the Buddha, not as some absolute reference, but as a very flawed body of literature that holds some truth and nuggets, but that's been monkeyed around with by a lot of people during a period of 500 years of oral transmission, when different schools of thought about what the Buddhists taught were, they were proliferating like a coronavirus. Really.
Yeah.
Well, there was something else I was going to say. It just, yes, the problem with all of these books and all of these podcasts and all of these teachers and all of this stuff is it's the clamoring of blind men. You know the story of the elephant and the blind man.
Yeah.
It's the clamoring of all of these blind men claiming to know what an elephant is.
And ultimately, even if one of those blind men is correct, it's something you yourself have to experience and understand, right? Nobody can do that for you.
That's right.
Yeah, but it does seem to be difficult. I mean, a lot of students talk about this. How do I know he's a good teacher? How do I know and it just seems to me that over and over it comes back to ehipassiko, see it for yourself, and then you will know.
I would say there's two things.
Yeah.
The first one is valuable, much harder to achieve. If you can somehow know that person well enough to say, they really have what it is that I'm looking for. But unfortunately, part of the clamor is telling you that what you're looking for is something different than what it is. So it makes it even harder to recognize whether somebody has or not. Not to mention how many of these people that actually have it are going to let you get close enough to know that.
But, Chula Das, it also seems that there really are some people who are really believe that what they're teaching and sharing is valuable and is the truth or is right. So it does seem like it's a very complicated thing to navigate for somebody who doesn't know any better. How should I know? Because if they don't even know, how should I know? So
it's a big problem.
It is a big problem.
Very much so. And yes, they do believe it. And there's all kinds of reasons. It could be that they have discovered the truth. It could be that they've partly discovered the truth. It could be that they've tried so hard that the only way that they can feel comfortable with how they've spent their life is to convince themselves that they've discovered the truth. There are a lot of sincere people claiming, a lot of sincere blind men claiming to know what the elephant looks like.
Yeah. But I think
and how does somebody tell?
Yeah. I think that's what I'm trying to get at is for us seekers, how do we avoid those sorts of traps and problems with teachers and with books and with I don't think I have a good answer for that.
I'm in the process of writing a book that I hope will help, a book on insight and awakening.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, I try to provide as much clear guidance as I can. On the other hand, I'm just trying to point out all those things that are not the path.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that's yeah. Well, I mean, I think those books are sorely needed, right? And we have talked about that before, why they're needed. So, Chilidarsa, next week when we meet up, I think what we'll do is we'll go back a little bit because we've covered a few years there with starting of Dharma Treasure and writing of TMI, but we haven't really talked about your cancer diagnosis, what happened with the Lyme disease, what was going on with your life, with your parents and with your wife and all that sort of thing, and sort of bring us up to speed. And we're rapidly approaching the present, I think.
Yes, those things did come later, so it's appropriate. Like, for example, the cancer diagnosis corresponded with the publication of TMI.
Okay, all right. So we will. Would that be all right? We go back and we'll just talk a little bit about what happened with the Lyme disease, because it seems like that's not something that you eventually.
That's the other thing. The cancer diagnosis and the publication of TMI coincided with each other and came shortly after overcoming once and for all, finally being free of Lyme disease.
Right. So that's why I thought there's some important, some good stuff there. So we'll pick that up next week if that's all right with you.
Wonderful. That's a really good place to start.
Thanks, Chilidarsa.
And you're going to keep this in the recording, I hope, so that people know what to look for in the next.
Yeah. I'll keep this at the end. Thanks.